today's session. Are they sharing okay, Dale? Great.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So as Dale says, we're going to be talking about our project to expand the nation's forests and how we make these new woodlands resilient. There's a lot going on in our Woodland Creation team at the moment, much of it already supported by colleagues across the organisation, and we're very grateful for all your efforts with this. Today we take the opportunity to bring you up to speed on where the programme is and to talk about some of the really important conversations which are starting to emerge. As Dale says, we're joined by Eleanor Tew, who is Forestry England's Natural Capital and Resilience Programme Manager, and by Bethany Cambridge, who's the Head of Planning and Operations in our Woodland Creation team. So they're going to explore some of the principles of natural capital and resilient woodlands and how they are guiding the work that we are doing on the design of new forests. As Dale said, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, so do pop them in the chat and vote on ones which are particularly interesting to you all. So just to recap first on what the programme is and where it's come from. Woodland Creation team is responsible for all new woodland across the estate, but our focus in recent months has really been on that which is funded by the government's Nature for Climate Fund. That's a budget which was announced just over a year ago. It's a 640 million fund to tackle the climate emergency, and about 500 million of that is for the promotion of tree planting, and a smaller part of that still will come to Forestry England. And we're asked to contribute around 2,400 hectares of new woodland by 2027. Now, instead of buying land freehold for this, we've got an innovative approach which involves leasing land, and we're looking for leases of 60 years plus, where we can offer the landowner a realistic commercial rent, offering them a good opportunity for diversification. These woodlands will be principally broadleaf, and we'll be looking for sites which will have the greatest natural capital impact. And Ellie's going to expand on that shortly. The woodlands will feel like Forestry England woodlands. They will be to all of us indivisible from the rest of the nation's forests. Important bit about the leasehold model is that it is really supportive of partnership working. So it encourages philanthropy, it encourages private investment, and as a consequence of this, we've had some really productive discussions with multinationals, charities, and public sector organisations, as well as those private landowners. And these are just a few of the household names who we are talking to, have approached us as part of the work that we're doing. And I guess the point to make here is that you know, they're putting their confidence in us, not because we've got a shiny new scheme, but because of the the great work that that we do already and that we're known for. So this is the first year of the scheme. We launched towards the end of March, and we ran an application window for landowners to come to us with potential sites, which we closed on the 1st of June. We had just over 2,000 hectares of land put forward, and since we closed the scheme, we've been gradually sifting through. So removing those speculative applications, removing sites where tree planting really obviously isn't going to be appropriate. And we're now down at this short list of around 900 hectares. And I'm really pleased that that's spread across the whole of the country, as you can see there. We're now carrying out a more detailed assessment of those sites and starting the negotiations with the landowners as we look to bring these forward. So all of this takes a lot of hard work. Very grateful for the contribution, particularly from districts in the assessments of these new sites. But to support this, we are growing our team nationally. Delighted this week to welcome Jim, Julia and Jess, who started on Monday just gone. And as you can see, we've got a very busy period of recruitments ahead of us over the summer. And these colleagues will be doing much of the heavy lifting of the programme as we continue with the discussion of landowners and seek the approval of these sites for woodland creation. Just before I pass over to Ellie, I wanted to conclude my little update by talking about where the Woodland Creation programme fits into our 5-year plan, into growing our future, which we've heard about earlier today. The Woodland Creation programme wasn't designed with growing our future in mind, but it does, like an awful lot of what we do, support it very well. And so we've got those 3 elements in the left-hand column taken straight from the 5-year plan, which we talked about earlier, and the challenges which we face there, that the UK has lost more biodiversity than most of the countries, that 13% of our species are at immediate risk of extinction. We know also how much, particularly over the last year, how much people have needed the green space which woodlands can provide. And of course, the nation's forests are critical for tackling the climate emergency and mitigating its future impacts. And that's really where the Nature for Climate programme originated. So how does woodland creation rise to these challenges? I've put a column there in the middle to describe how our assessment tool identifies the natural capital on site, which we'd seek to protect and improve. So we'll only take forward those sites which have the greatest impact on nature recovery, on our communities, and on the climate emergency. And we'll design them with resilience so that they provide those range of benefits now, but crucially that they continue to provide those range of benefits into the future. It'd be a horrible irony if woodlands designed to tackle the climate emergency became a victim of it in years to come. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on what we see good as looking like at the end of our 5-year plan. And we have this idea of the woodlands that we've created starting to bed into the landscape, and that they're starting to build up the natural capital within them. So they're making those connections with people, they're helping the nature recovery. And in 5 years, they'll just be starting to lock up carbon. Really important final point there is, given who we are, we should be leading by example with this. We should be inspiring other managers, other land managers, to continue the tree planting effort, which we are spearheading here. Because done well, this programme will provide a solid foundation for us to have a woodland creation programme which extends far beyond the Nature for Climate Fund, and that seems to me a place that Forestry England should be in. So I'm going to pass over to Ellie now. Thanks, Ellie.
Thank you, Jim. Let me know when my slides appear.
Yep, there you go.
Perfect. Okay, thanks very much. So, as we all know, our forests provide this huge range of benefits to society. These images are just a few examples. And of course, new woodland creation is a fantastic opportunity to provide even, oh, I'm getting a bit of feedback. So new woodland creation is this fantastic opportunity to provide even more of those benefits in new locations. But obviously we want to make sure that we're creating the right type of woodland in the right locations in order to maximise that additional value. And that's where our natural capital approach comes in. So hopefully many of you will be a bit familiar with natural capital. It's basically just a way of describing the range of benefits that our natural environment provides to us as humans. So all of these images here on the slide represent different benefits provided by our natural capital resource, which is our forests. And in the Woodland Partnership, we're using natural capital analysis at various stages to help us in that ambition to maximise the public value of our new woodland sites. So first of all, we're scoring all of the potential sites that enter the scheme for their existing and for their potential natural capital value. Now, obviously, any site might already have features that we wouldn't want to replace with Woodland Creation. So we're assessing each site for features like existing woodland, and in particular, ancient semi-natural woodland, conservation sites like SSSIs, other priority habitats, and scheduled monuments. And if any of those are present on the site, they're deemed to be irreplaceable, and we're excluding them from our potential Woodland Creation scoring. So then in the remaining area, we're assessing the potential natural capital value that would arise through Woodland Creation. And in that, we're considering biodiversity. So in particular, focusing here on landscape connectivity and restoration. Watershed benefits, things like water quality and flood amelioration. People and recreation. So for example, is the location going to be close to a high population centre? And air quality. And each site is given a score for all of those features, and that's allowing us to identify which site would have the biggest natural capital value through Woodland Creation. So then later on in the process, when we're coming to the forest design stage, we then have a forest design decision support tool, get the words out, a decision support tool that compares different site design scenarios and helps us to design a forest landscape that will maximise the natural capital value from that site. So the idea here is that natural capital will be integrated through all stages of the process, right from that initial site screening through to design and the eventual establishment of the woodland. And all of these tools and assessments are undergoing continuous development, so we will continue to improve them over the next 5 years of the Woodland Partnership programme. But if we're going to realise all those natural capital benefits, as Jim rightly points out, we need to make sure that our new woodlands are resilient. And as we're all very aware, there's this huge range of environmental and social pressures that our woodlands are facing, both existing and of course our new woodland sites. And if our forests are going to survive, they need to be able to withstand and adapt to these threats. So resilience is about lessening the impacts of threats and risks on the things that we want to deliver. And we need to adapt our approach to each site depending on what our objectives are and what the possible threats might be. But having said that, there are some general principles that can be integrated into every woodland design to increase resilience. So basically, increasing forest resilience is largely about spreading risk. We can't predict exactly what the future holds or how different forest systems are going to be able to adapt. So we want to spread our eggs into as many different baskets as possible. And that's why diversity is so important. And there are 5 key principles, which I'm going to talk through now. So first up is tree species diversity. Now, in this country, we've historically had an over-reliance on a limited range of tree species. So almost 90% of our conifer area is made up of just 6 species. For broadleaves, it's a little bit better, but there are still just 5 species that make up 60% of broadleafed area. And there are already a wide range of pests and diseases affecting those principal species. Unfortunately, that's only likely to get worse. So we rapidly need to increase the variety of tree species that we have in our woodlands. Now that's pretty challenging in our existing forests. You have to wait for opportunities like new restocks, or you have to use techniques like underplanting. But our Woodland Creation sites are this brilliant opportunity to get it right from the start, make sure that we're committed to planting a really wide range of tree species at every site. So the next principle is structural diversity. Now, productive forest management systems in the country have traditionally favoured even-aged monocultures. They're relatively easy to manage and they produce high volumes of timber, but unfortunately they're not very resilient. So a disturbance or disease can really quickly move through huge areas of forest and have catastrophic impacts. So breaking up the landscape is really important for resilience, and there's lots of different ways in which we can do that. We can have much smaller compartment sizes, or we can use techniques like continuous cover forestry, which increase that fine scale structural diversity. So in our woodland creation, the key is to create a diversity of structures across the landscape, and we can do that by planning different combinations of management strategies and tree species, so that again we have a really diverse forest landscape from the outset. The third principle is genetic diversity. Now, as we know, trees live for a very long time, and the trees that we're planting today are going to mature in very different environmental conditions. So genetic diversity is really important because it increases the likelihood that trees will be able to adapt to those future conditions. Now, in all of our planting, and in particular in our new woodland creation, we're advocating what we call a portfolio approach. And that means using a range of seed sources and a range of establishment techniques to maximise that genetic diversity of our trees. So that includes a combination of natural regeneration and natural colonisation, using local seed sources and assisted migration. So assisted migration means sourcing seeds from locations that currently have a climate similar to what we're expecting to see in future. And by sourcing seeds from those locations, the trees have genetics that are already adapted to our potential future climate. And we can use really sophisticated climate matching techniques to help us with that. And that's what the example map on the bottom right shows. So the appropriate balance of these different techniques varies in different locations and with different objectives. But using this portfolio of techniques overall is a really important way in which we're going to increase tree genetic diversity and help our trees to be able to adapt to that very uncertain future. So those first three principles have really been focusing on the trees themselves, but the wider biodiversity of a forest is fundamental to its health and its resilience. And if you have been in the biodiversity sessions in the mornings run by Andrew, then he covered some of this really well. And so I'm just going to reinforce and add to some of those points about why biodiversity is so important for resilience. So when we're referring to biodiversity, we're talking about the range and the diversity of species that we have in the environment, and that includes plants, fungi, bacteria, and animals. And there are two reasons why biodiversity is so important for woodland creation. So first of all, the forests that have lots of biodiversity are best able to deliver that full range of benefits that we discussed earlier in terms of natural capital. So those forests are often much more productive because they're functioning really efficiently. Secondly, our more biodiverse ecosystems are much more stable and resilient. They're able to withstand or recover from disturbance more quickly. So for example, maybe there's better natural pest control, or the soils are healthier, which is better able to support natural regeneration. Where biodiversity has been depleted, the forest as a whole is much more stressed, it's more vulnerable, and disturbance can have disproportionately much greater impacts. And finally, related to that is the importance of functional diversity, and in particular the idea of functional redundancy. So the best way to describe this is with an example. Imagine you have a forest with lots of different species of fungi in it that are all involved in recycling leaf litter. Now, if one of those species goes extinct, there are still lots of these other species already there that can compensate for that extinction, and the leaf litter will still get recycled. But in contrast, if there are only a couple of species to start with that do that leaf litter recycling function, if you lose one of them, there are some really significant implications for that function and the ecosystem as a whole. So the forest in that second example is much more vulnerable and it's less resilient. So functional redundancy is about making sure that there are lots of different species that all perform similar ecological functions. And that's important because we don't know how and we don't know if different species are going to be able to adapt to future conditions. So overall, that wider biodiversity is absolutely fundamental to resilience. Now, woodland creation is generally really positive for biodiversity, but of course, there's lots that we can do to add value. So that includes making sure that there's a really good balance of habitats, both different types of woodland habitat, but also non-woodland habitats. We can enhance key features like watercourses and veteran trees. And we can make sure that there's really good connectivity across the site so that species are able to move around and colonise new areas. So those 5 diversity principles are really important for us to prioritise in all of our woodland creation schemes. But having said that, that has to be underpinned by making effective site-based decisions. So we need to select species and we need to select silvicultural systems that are well suited to the soils and to the climate of the site. And that's integral to creating a healthy and resilient forest that has that high natural capital value, delivering lots of different benefits. So we need to incorporate all of these diversity principles through that lens of bespoke site assessments. So that's some of the theory about how we're going to make our new woodlands resilient, and I'm now just going to pass over to Beth, who's going to talk us through a case study to show how we're going about putting it into practice.
Great, thank you. I'll share my screen and just give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Perfect. So as Ellie said, I'm going to talk a little bit about Pleasant Farm and demonstrate how we've incorporated some of these principles around forest resilience into practice there. So back in January 2020, Forestry England bought Pleasant Farm, which is in North Kent, and it's a 118 hectare farm. It's currently managed for cereal crops and grazing. And the site's made up of these 5 different plots, which are separated by the M20 motorway and bordered by the Channel Tunnel rail link, which is just to the north. And in the middle, you can see a small village called Platts Heath. So just sort of taking a step back, Pleasant Farm itself has been managed under farming. The adjacent areas of woodland and hedgerows are really remnants of what has historically been quite a different landscape. So as with much of the British landscape, over the centuries, hedgerows and woodlands have been lost. And that's really down to the intensification of both farming, but also large-scale transport infrastructure. And the consequence of that is that the woodland habitats have become fragmented and disconnected. So one of our key strategic objectives at Pleasant Farm is to reconnect these fragmented woodland habitats and improve connectivity at a landscape scale. So our primary aim at Pleasant Farm is to create a woodland that's sustainable and resilient and productive, and one that delivers high natural capital value, is compliant with UK forestry standard, but importantly, it'll be multifunctional. So it'll capture carbon, it will deliver biodiversity net gain, it will provide us with a financial return through the trees and the timber that we produce. And it will also be resilient as far as possible to forecasted climate change and pests and diseases. And the site will also provide an informal recreational resource for local people in Platts Heath. But underpinning all of those objectives is really forest resilience, and that's key to us being able to achieve our long-term aims. So in terms of what forest resilience looks like at Pleasant Farm, if we kick off with wildlife, to ensure that our plans are beneficial for existing wildlife, as well as trying to increase the biodiversity value, we carried out a range of walkover surveys and wildlife surveys. And that really showed that the site is of limited wildlife value. There isn't very much there at the moment. And most of the biodiversity is connected to the fairly species poor hedgerows that are at Pleasant Farm. So the potential for biodiversity net gain is pretty significant. Some of the main species that were found through those surveys, you can see on the screen, are badgers, dormice, great crested newts and bats. So to help guide our forest design, we followed Lawton's principles of better, bigger, connected and more. And this diagram demonstrates those principles. So better means creating a diverse range of habitats and microhabitats within them. Connected means ensuring that habitats are within an easy travelling distance for a range of wildlife and that they work at different scales, so within Pleasant Farm, but also connecting Pleasant Farm to neighbouring sites. So really creating that stepping stone network for wildlife across the local area. And by creating a range of habitats for great crested newts and dormice, we'll be enhancing the populations of some of the rarest animals that we found at Pleasant Farm. But those two species will really importantly act as flagship species. So they will create opportunities for a much wider range of other species to thrive at Pleasant Farm. One way that we're creating a stepping stone network for great crested newts is by creating 10 new ponds within 500 metres of each other. And they'll be connected by woodland and grassland. And again, will act as those stepping stones that allow the great crested newt to move from the existing pond on site and spread across the site and further out of Pleasant Farm. So thinking about hedgerows and some of the ways that we're also looking to improve biodiversity, quite a lot of the hedgerows that exist at the moment are quite gappy, so there's whole lengths missing in some cases. So what we intend to do is both create brand new hedgerows, but also restore those existing ones by filling in the gaps with native trees and shrub species. So you can see on the top kind of what's there now and a sort of future concept for what those will look like. Also graded edges, so thinking about the edges of our woodland blocks are really important for wildlife. So we'll be looking to plant native shrubs to create a graded edge to the woodland block. So you can see at the bottom what that means and kind of what that will look like. And we'll manage the paths and the rides and the clearings that we create at Pleasant Farm to create those sinuous margins, so those kind of curvy edges, which will promote biodiversity. And as well as promoting biodiversity, it also softens the appearance of the woodland, so it makes it look that bit less harsh in the landscape. And connecting hedgerows to these woodland edges will create a network of habitat corridors that encourage wildlife to travel within and beyond Pleasant Farm. And the native shrubs will also provide that dense cover, the pollen, the nectar and the fruits all year round that some of these species rely on. Thinking about natural regeneration, that's also a key part to the design. So parts of Pleasant Farm are adjacent to some nice ancient woodland. And in these areas, what we're looking to do is plant native broadleaf species, but also leave areas open to allow to basically get those species in the ancient woodland to seed into Pleasant Farm and allow the natural regeneration. So overall, we used a biodiversity metric calculator and we're forecasting around a 60% improvement in biodiversity net gain. We also looked at future climate projections, so we compared 2010 with 2070, and in the southeast of England we can expect the climate to be hotter with more rain over winter and less over summer. So those extremes of climate, and what that is likely to mean at Pleasant Farm is that the trees that we're planting are likely to suffer from drought stress. So an important part in looking at our species selection was to use the climate matching tool. and that matched Pleasant Farm's future climate to areas in sort of northern and central France, and then down the west coast of France by the 2070s, so in just sort of 50 years' time. And then based on the climate matching tool, we decided that a mixture of native provenances and French provenances from up to 2 degrees south should be planted. And using provenance maps, we pulled together this table. Also linked to provenance, we're looking to create some wildflower meadows and looking to use local provenance green hay, which are suited to the green sand soils which are present at Pleasant Farm. So we use all of that information and work closely with Forest Research, who produced a silviculture and species report for us based on the soil types present and the forecasted climate. And those recommendations were combined with information that we got from ESC, the Ecological Site Classification tool. So all of that informed our final decisions around species. And this table shows the 18 different species of broadleaf, the 22 species of conifer, and the 14 shrub species that are going to be planted, all of which are from a range of provenances, so that local provenance, but also provenances further south. So as Ellie said, not putting all of our eggs in one basket and trying to create that diversity. In terms of some of the other things that we've incorporated at Pleasant Farm, the most southerly plot south of the village has several overhead power lines which cut across the plot and really restrict the plantable area. So instead, what we're looking to do is work with plant seed supply to create a seed orchard. That would be a broadleaf seed orchard with the trees topped at 3 metres. So those trees can be planted underneath the power lines and is really productive use of that space. So we'll be planting 4 hectares of improved silver birch and common alder, and that will provide future genetic material for Pleasant Farm as well as other woodlands. Pleasant Farm will also contribute to research around forest resilience. So we have an operational trial of 19 different conifer species, which will be established by Forest Research to record the growth and the productivity of species on sandy soils and in likely drought conditions. We are also working with the Future Trees Trust and doing a progeny trial of sycamore. So that will assess the genetic components of high quality sycamore trees, and they'll be monitored regularly for the health, the growth, their form and the timing of the bud burst. And once that trial is complete, the mature trees can then be used as a tested seed orchard. We're partnering with Kent County Council to do quite an interesting trial around the alternative management of highways corridors, and that investigates whether natural regeneration or sort of broadcast sowing techniques can be used to create new woodlands in corridors that are adjacent to the highway. So really focus on making the highways network more environmentally resilient. And then last but not least, we'll be looking to monitor our biodiversity in the long term and see how all of this great work that the teams put into place pays off. So we'll be doing regular transects for birds and butterflies, moths, great crested newts and dormice, and we'll be setting those up in partnership with local volunteers and stakeholders. And we are also looking at environmental DNA techniques to measure changes in biodiversity, which I think Andrew touched on earlier this morning. One part of forest resilience, which perhaps doesn't kind of spring to mind straight away, is the social resilience and getting the buy-in from local residents. So the day before we made the public announcement last year, we sent flyers to all local residents to inform them directly of our plans. So introducing ourselves as their friendly new neighbour. And shortly afterwards, we delivered a paper questionnaire, and that identified how local people want to use the site, any concerns that they have, and that fed into the concept design. And we then presented that during COVID. We held various public consultations, all of which were online. The questions in the bottom left corner came from an eco-warrior group at the local primary school who are very excited to hear about our plans and what we're going to create. That is the team having the video call with the local primary school, and we also had video calls with neighbours, and we used all of that feedback to build our final design plan. And a couple of the other images that are coming up on the screen just show the kind of wider engagement that we had with the local community, so with the parish council, the local MP, and we had lots of really positive promotion. And we aim to continue that engagement as we move into the delivery phase, as we start to plant trees this winter, and also with getting volunteer groups set up. So I think a really important part of it is trying to get that buy-in from local people, who ultimately will be the kind of future sort of custodians of that woodland, and help make sure that it's managed well. So this is the final design. So I think fair to say a kind of fairly sort of boring blank sheet with not very much there, and this is what we are looking to create. So we're looking to start planting this winter. We'll plant about 2/3 of the site and plant the remainder in 2022. And just a couple of nice visualizations before we move on to questions. So we use these in the public consultation, and these are pulled together by the landscape architect team. So this shows what the woodland looks like, or what the farm looks like now, and what the new woodland might look like once it reaches maturity, and also how well it fits within the wider landscape, which has quite a lot of sort of fragmented woodland. And that's it from me. So I'll stop presenting, and happy to answer any questions that have come up in the chat.
Thank you very much, Bethany, Eleanor and Jim, for your presentation. We have got 5 minutes now if we want to take some questions, and as Jim mentioned, I will go with the ones that have got the most thumbs up next to them. So we'll start with this question from Scott Martin. Can you please tell us more about the other possible species that will or may be used? I think that was when you were on the forest resilience slide.
Yeah, I can try and answer that. I mean, what a massive question and so little time. So I'm not going to go into any specifics here, but just sort of talk a bit generally. So I think there's two parts to that. There's making better use of our existing suite of native species. We've sort of traditionally focused on quite a narrow subset of species that we've used in productive forestry, and we do have a very broad range of species that are still going to be perfectly suitable in future climates. So there's great options there to use what we might classify as more of our minor species that are emerging, things like wild service tree actually, that have a great potential that we've traditionally not focused on, but might come to the fore more, particularly with climate change. And then there's also looking further afield. So in particular, Europe, Pacific Northwest, and looking at climate change and where things are moving, perhaps using different species of things like oaks that actually are, a different species of oak that is from more southern Europe that might be more suitable for future climates. I'll post a link in the chat to work being done in forest research, particularly led by Chris Reynolds, who is exploring all of this. He's looking at what are called our principal species, our secondary species, plot stage species and specimen species. So there's obviously a massive diversity of different species that are out there that we can potentially use, and the key of course is to make sure that we are using our diversity and that we don't just think of alternative species and focus on another subset of species. We want to make sure we're continuing to think broadly. So I hope that helps a bit, Scott. Sorry it's not particularly specific, but happy to discuss in more detail if that would be helpful.
It's probably just worth linking that to another question from Danny, asking about whether we're restricted to native broadleaves. I think you've answered that already, Ellie, but from a policy position, no, we're not, for exactly the reasons that Ellie's described there.
Thank you, Jim. We had another question that had a lot of votes, which was the ponds at Pleasant Farm will be fenced to keep dogs out. So just to respond to that question, a sacrificial dog pond will also be constructed as a decoy. So does anyone want to add anything on that, or should we move on to another question?
No, I don't think so. I think it's we've got similar examples at other woodlands. Thinking of Jeskins comes to mind. It's actually quite interesting, the kind of chemicals that kind of dogs that can kind of have on their coats can have a really detrimental impact to biodiversity, and also just the disturbance they cause when they kind of go in after the tennis ball to fetch it. So it's a lesson learned, I think, kind of over the years, and I think is a really sort of practical, sort of fairly straightforward measure to use.
Great, thank you, Bethany. The last one that's got a thumbs up next to it is more of a comment, but you may like to expand on, which is from Fran. The shrub corridors throughout the planting should be harvested for biomass on a cyclic basis to maintain a diversity of structures.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I believe that the species, or certainly some of the species that we've chosen, will be basically managed on a kind of coppice sort of rotation. So we'll provide that kind of biomass from kind of fairly early on in the kind of woodland creation scheme.
I think we've got time for one more question. There's a question here from Neil, which is about nurseries, and it's, are trees and shrub nurseries geared up for the species and provenance, e.g. climate matched, diversity illustrated?
I'll start by answering that and then probably pass to Beth and Ellie. For my part, just to say that Forestry England isn't acting in isolation on any of this. We're obviously part of a much larger programme, that Nature for Climate programme, and Forest Services are investing a lot in ensuring that there is capacity to deliver the programme. That's led by our colleague David Bowles, which is looking particularly about how the nurseries across the sector can be brought on stream to deliver the level of planting which we are aspiring to over the next 5 years. Beth, do you want to say a few words about specifically the work that we're doing with Chris and our own nurseries?
Yeah. So we've been discussing the kind of plant requirements for our programme over the past few months. What we're looking to do fairly kind of early on is on a fairly sort of high level look at what we think will be the kind of main species and the kind of main provenances that we're likely to use, so we can start growing those trees ready to plant those in what is a kind of fairly demanding programme in terms of creating the 2,500 hectares of new woodlands that we want to create over the next 5 years. So the Woodland Creation team will be placing a kind of central tree order, and then as we have our pipeline of sites and they develop and the plans and detail behind kind of which species are appropriate, we'll then refine those orders. So I think what's really crucial is that we make sure that we're planting the right species and the right provenances, and we won't be kind of rushed into creating woodland if we sort of don't have those right tree species and provenances lined up. So that may mean that we have to plant sites over several years to make sure that we're getting the right seed. I don't know if you have anything more to add to that, Ellie.
Thank you so much. There's still plenty of questions coming in, but I'm afraid we've run to the end of this session with the next one running in 5 minutes. So we are going to have to put a stop there, but perhaps we can leave the chat open. And if Ellie, Jim and Bethany have time, perhaps they could reply to some of the unanswered questions through the chat. But if you'd like to join me in thanking Jim, Ellie and Bethany for a great presentation and some really engaging questions, and those who would like to join us, the next session is on the England Trees Action Plan and is at 1:35. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you all. Thanks, Dale.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dale.
Thank you.